Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Tiffany Tsang, Head of DB, LGPS and Investment at the PLSA. For this webinar, we'll be focusing our lens on the upcoming and intensely anticipated General Code of Practice. About 2 years ago, the first consultation for TPR sought views on the draft combination of most of its existing codes of practice into a single document. The PLSA, and our consultation response at the time, welcomed the objectives of this project, but we asked for clarity on a range of issues. For instance, we asked for clear signposting on what aspects of the code are new and clear signposting on where there have been changes to existing guidance, so track changes in essence, but more on the details of what our response asked for later. So we're told it is now due to launch very soon. Those of you in the audience who RSVP'd early on to this event will know that we originally planned this webinar with TPR jointly thinking the new code would have been published by now, but it's been delayed ever so slightly again. And I suspect our guest today will get grilled on the publication timeline amongst many other issues that I expect will be raised, but I'm told he's ready for our members' tough questions, so get them ready. Nick Gannon, Policy Delivery Lead from the Pensions Regulator, is here today with us, ready to brave your questions. So just to give you an outline of what to expect in the next 45 minutes, Nick has some slides for us. He'll speak to them for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then I'll start with some questions to Nick. So thank you to those in the audience who sent in some questions ahead of time to us. I'll be sure to draw on them over the course of the session. Also, please do type some of your questions to the Q&A box as well during the session, and I promise I'll get through as many as possible. If you want to vote on the questions that you like most, there's like a thumbs up sign that you can press, and that'll help me to zero in on the most popular questions and focus on those first. So without further delay, I'll turn it over to Nick. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Tiffany, and good morning to everyone. Yes, as Tiffany says, it would have been nice to be talking about the code as it was actually in the wild. But for those of you who doubt, I can assure you it does exist. Sort of, hang on, get the blur right. This is a few slides now about sort of the story about how we got here and what we've done, and then I'm sure you're all engaged enough to kind of know that, but I think it's worth starting off there, and then we can go into questions and perhaps some of the finer detail as we move on. So if I could go for the next slide, please. I'll start out, as I usually do, with talking about the code, about actually what the status of our codes of practice are. So they're not legislation and they're not guidance, they sort of sit in the middle. So our codes set out expectations for the conduct and practice of those who need to follow them. What that means in practice is we set out the ways that the schemes that trustees, governing bodies, we expect should behave, and it's particularly useful in relation to regulations where they tend to use words like appropriate and regular and relevant. So codes in part explain what those are as well. That said, if we find situations where we feel the need to use our powers, then our codes of practice must be taken into consideration by a court or our determination panel when reaching a conclusion, and we can issue improvement notices or compliance notices in relation to our codes of practice. So it can kind of be held up as the template for good behaviour, if you like. If we move on to the next slide. Now, all that said about our codes, seems like an awful lot of people don't use them very much. So there's a few stats here. So back in 2021, 36% of DC trustees had never used or were not aware of our codes of practice. And the most recent DC survey, which hasn't been published yet, that's not actually showing an awful lot of move in that number either. 2022 survey showed about 18% of DB trustees had never used or were not aware of codes of practice, which you would think with the focus on scheme funding is a bit of a surprise. So the next two bullets that are possibly of more concern, though. So, you know, obviously, as it stands at the moment, we have 16 codes of practice. 35% of DC trustees had never read any code other than code 13 or 15 for that small proportion who deal with master trusts. 38% of DB trustees had never read a code other than Code of Practice 3. So that's great in terms of scheme funding, but it means that they're completely blindsided by the governance. So the TC code is fairly well rounded and sort of explains a fair amount about actually how to run a pension scheme, in our opinion. But yeah, the DB code is obviously very focused on scheme funding, so there's potentially a bit of a governance gap going on there. That's quite worrying. So move on to the next slide. Now, that potential sort of governance gap, that lack of awareness of our codes is one of the one of the reasons for us undertaking this work. Some of the other reasons here is you can actually kind of see down the right hand side of that table. Actually, some of our codes are getting rather old, and there's a first couple there that you know, will be celebrating their 18th birthday just slightly before this code comes out, right? And then there's others in there where there were changes in 2015 that affected them and means that they're no longer quite accurate. And there's other codes that don't actually reflect our current expectations or practice. So there was a plenty of good reason there to open these things up. And then the Occupational Pension Scheme Governance Amendments Regulations 2018 came in. They transposed the few bits of IOP2 from EU legislation into UK that weren't already in place in the UK. And what that actually did is, because of the way they were written, they actually kind of gave us a catalyst to actually open the lid on these codes and go, well, actually what we can do is we can pull them all together. We can actually make them better, make them more up to date. So what you've got there is all the ones that are in blue are the codes that are incorporated in this program. All the ones that are pink are the ones that currently aren't part of this. Now, there's some good reasons for this. At the outset of this project, we knew there was a Pension Schemes Act likely to be in course. We knew that, therefore, DB schemes were likely to get an updated code, so we left the sort of the DB bits out. Master trusts at the time were going through authorization, so it seemed a little bit cruel to try and move the goalposts halfway through, back in the days when we thought this was going to happen really quite quickly. And CDC schemes at that point didn't even actually exist. So yeah, they got left out. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So some of the big sort of design features on the new code. So what we've aimed to do is aim for consistency in our expectations for all scheme types. Now, not every scheme has the same legislation or the same legislative requirements placed upon it, but generally speaking, our expectations for how do you run a pension scheme well, pretty much the same for everyone, be you DB, DC, PS, hybrid, whatever. So we've tried as far as possible to get that consistency. It's shorter than the codes it replaces. So, you know, for a start, there's only one instead of 10. And it's also, yeah, probably about 40% of the length of the original codes. What we've done, though, is we've taken the content, and back in the days when we were in offices, we basically cut the codes up and moved them around on post-it notes on a wall until we found out that basically they all end up into 5 key areas. One's the governing body, so the people who run the show, funding and investment, the money, administration, the people who actually keep the wheels turning, communications and disclosure, which is telling people things, and reporting to TPR, which is telling us things. And we've also taken the opportunity to uplift some of the guidance that we published in the space where we didn't really have anything to kind of hang a hook on it. So there was no sort of legislative underpin for us to actually make it higher than guidance. Couple of key issues here: cybersecurity, which we've been, you know, raising as a significant issue for many years now. That now makes an appearance in the code, and ESG matters as well. We've got a couple of modules in the code that deal with ESG. fairly high level with a view to the fact that we know that there's more legislation likely to be forthcoming. We've also broadened some of the expectations. So some of the things that we'd said in code previously are very sort of, I suppose, parochial in terms of they only deal with one particular type of scheme, and financial transactions is one of those. It appears in the DC code, but that's driven by the requirement for DC schemes to maintain and operate core financial transactions. Whereas actually we realized that the principles behind that apply equally to pension schemes. Pension schemes get money in, they invest it typically, and they pay money out. Even those ones that don't have investments receive money and pay money out. So there's important bits there of financial transactions that run across all the scheme types. If we move on to the next slide. I've mentioned the word module on one occasion. So although it is a large papery object, that's a feature of the fact that it has to be laid in Parliament. The code itself is actually designed to be web-based. So we recognise that many trustees now actually go into meetings with their iPad or their computer or whatever, and all the meeting papers are on email. And you know that's how they engage with things, and it's how we all engage with pretty much everything. You know, we all welded to the little black cube in the phone or whatever. So it's designed for ease of use, simple navigation, efficient search. If anyone's ever tried searching on the TPR website, you'll know that efficient search was actually a major selling point for us. So online look and feel. What you see in paper is pretty much what you will see on the screen. But we can do things on the screen like sort of hide certain bits like the glossary, so that doesn't necessarily take up lots of space. It means you can focus on the key points. So key features of this are, you'll see at the top there's a little grey box which mentions the systems of governance, and I'll come on to that in a second. Then we generally have a couple of opening paragraphs around who it applies to. And you can see there's a couple of little hyperlinks there in pink, which allow you to hop between modules just to kind of get a sense of what related content is. Then you're down into the main body of the stuff, which is basically our expectations are set out in bullets. Now, we know previously that if you tried reading a code of practice, it's not always easy to find what our expectations are because they are hidden in sort of long paragraphs of text, whereas what we've done is we've broken them down here and actually set them out in bullets. I do apologise for sort of greying that out. I think if you squint at the screen, you can probably see what our expectations are. But because this hasn't been laid in Parliament yet, I don't really want to advertise it too much. For the record, this remuneration and fee policy is the shortest module, but all of them tend to run to sort of 2 or 3 pages. So that gives you a pretty good idea. Oh, and finally, there's a glossary at the foot of the page there that just explains some of the terms that we use in that particular module. The reason that we have a glossary on each page rather than a centralized glossary is that some terms have different meanings depending on exactly what we're talking about. So employer is one of them. Relevant scheme is another one, where depending on the bit of legislation you're talking about, they've recycled the term. So if we move on to the next slide. So big increase in importance. Code 9, as was internal controls. We've realized that actually an awful lot of governance is making sure that things happen properly, which is pretty much a definition of internal controls. So there's a lot of risk management in there, but it's also about understanding how systems and processes work, and making sure that the people who are operating those are operating them correctly. So we've got what's about a dozen modules now on various aspects of internal controls. So that's goes beyond the old sort of risk register idea, goes into things like scheme continuity planning, so business continuity things, risk management. There's a new risk management function there for schemes. Also things there like cybersecurity, as I've said, monitoring contributions and record keeping. So all these things are actually at the core of making sure that the scheme operations function properly. On to the next slide, which I think is a first of our, yes, it's first of our new acronym. So Effective Systems Governance, or ESOG, as it's been christened. The regulations I mentioned earlier on, the 2018 Governance Amendments Regulations, introduced a new term, an effective system of governance that all schemes had to follow, all private sector schemes had to follow. And that left us with a quandary of actually what is an effective system of governance? We've not written anything anywhere about an effective system of governance. And the more we actually thought about it, the more we realized we had actually written about an effective system of governance. What it basically is it's making sure your scheme is running appropriately. And we'd written bits of code about that. So what we did when we cut everything up and reassembled it was to actually sort of assess those bits that we think are the core features of running an effective system of governance. And you can see there, that's about 25, 26 modules that are discussed there. That's about actually half the code in terms of the number of modules. Move on to the next slide. The other big new acronym that we've come up with is the Own Risk Assessment, or ORA. I'm sure people, if they're vaguely familiar with some of the development here, have heard the term bandied around. And I think there have been a lot of sort of concerns and scare stories about what the ORA would be. And in fact, I think actually the ORA, as we consulted on it, was possibly the source of some of those. What we've done is we have reconsidered the ORA to some extent. It's basically a review of the effectiveness and the risks in the effective system governance. So I think it's important that actually if you're looking at what you do first, you look at your effective system of governance, and then your ORA, you will have time to get that in place. Comes much later. So it's not kind of putting the cart before the horse. It's making sure you get the things in place. The ESOG's the important thing. The ORA also is an internal document. It doesn't have to be published. So it's designed to be useful for the trustees that carry it out. Now, that's not to say that other people won't be interested in it. And indeed, I think given time, if TPR ever has cause to come and have a conversation with a governing body, then actually the own risk assessment is possibly a place where they'll actually start and say, well, what are the risks associated with your scheme? What have you identified, and how are you approaching them? One of the big spoilers, I suppose, for what happens with the own risk assessment is the timing. So we consulted on timing. We got a fair degree of comment on that. Some interesting views, and a lot of actually different legal interpretations of what the regulation said. So what we've done with the timing there is, in the final version, we've moved much closer to what the regulations say, rather than what we'd actually said. But the content and approach is very much set out in the code still. So if we move on to the next slide. So as Tiffany opened with, we consulted actually nearly, well, we would have been in the consultation period now 2 years ago. During the consultation period, we spoke with over 1,000 members of the pension community. We were in lockdown at the time, I'm sure you remember. And actually, technology like this, like Zoom, like Teams, actually gave us the facility to talk to an awful lot more people face to face, I suppose, virtually, than we would otherwise have managed in a consultation. So over 1,000 members of the pension community sort of in conversation. And then 103 formal responses we received, which I think is the second most to any TPR consultation ever. Unfortunately, because we'd consulted on 51 modules, we'd asked 5 or 6 questions about each module. Some truly heroic people tried to answer nearly every question, and we got, well, 17,397 individual answers to questions. Which has taken us rather a long time to go through, because we have given meaningful consideration to every response, and they have led to genuine content and design changes. So what I would say is we have sought to improve the clarity of who the various modules apply to. We have sought to improve the clarity of the expectation. And we have actually also rejigged a few modules as well. So some modules just didn't flow well between what they were trying to do, and you were sort of replicating content across modules or breaking it up in inappropriate ways. So actually, we've retired a couple of modules, we've introduced a couple of modules, we've renamed and restructured a few modules. We started out with 51 modules, we've ended up with 51 modules. Generally speaking, though, I think the expectations are pretty much the same, apart from in a couple of areas such as the own risk assessment. So thank you very much to everyone who took the time to either engage with us 2 years ago or provide us with any kind of response. And I'm just very sorry that it's taken this long. I know the anticipation is, getting too much to bear. It certainly is for me as well. But yes, looking forward to everyone actually getting to see it. I think that was my last slide, but do click on just to be on the safe side. Oh, okay, yes, what happens next? So it will be laid in Parliament very, very soon. Not this week, but because Parliament goes on holiday in a couple of days' time, but very, very soon thereafter. Before it comes into force, it needs to sit in Parliament for 40 days. So that's 40 sitting days, which is normally counts basically days when they're sitting and weekends. But as I'm sure you're all aware, we get quite a lot of days off in May. So it doesn't count bank holidays, which kind of extends that 40-day period calendar-wise. So depending on exactly when it's laid after Easter, end of June, early July is probably when it comes into force. But it will be widely publicised. Don't worry, you're not going to miss it. And if you are sort of completely new to this and it sounds all big and scary and rather concerning, our consultation page is actually still up. So there's the address for it. If you scroll right to the bottom of the page, you can actually find a sort of a working volume version of what the final web-based code actually looks like. And I think that's probably the better one to interact with at this stage. Or of course, you could just sort of sit still for a couple of weeks and wait to see what it actually looks like. And that definitely was my last slide on that occasion. So now I'll move over to Tiffany and questions from the floor.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was really helpful. And just the chair looking at the time, we've got 40 minutes, which is fantastic, a very luxurious slot that we've got left to answer. I think we'll be able to get to all your questions, actually, which is fantastic. There have been a bunch of questions that have come in previous to the webinar and also live now around publication date, implementation timelines, which I think you've gone a long way in answering. If there's any more detail you could add, that'd be really helpful. But there was someone here. Let me just scroll up to the questions. So Barry's asked, do you think the general code will ever be published, given that publication at the same time as retained EU law bill is going through Parliament, maybe unpalatably politically?
From what I understand, there are no issues related to the EU origins of some of this. I think it's important to note that, yeah, while I mentioned IOP 2, most of IOP 2 actually reflected the practice that was already in place in the UK. So the regulations that actually introduced this were probably only about 3 pages long. They were very, very short, or rather, the regulations that catalyzed this were very, very short. I think, in truth, barring a couple of terms, we would eventually have come out with something that looked very similar to this. So yes, I think it will be published, and it will be published soon. And yes, I don't anticipate any problems with the retained EU legislation bill.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to go backwards to a question that someone had sent to us before the webinar a few weeks ago. So just to kind of lay the scene, because I think there's several questions kind of pinned around this as well. So someone said to us that there's been a lot of work that's already been done to cross-check governance documentation against the draft code, which is a tremendous amount of work. And some feel that there's been a little benefit reaped so far to use their language. And so the final general code may actually cause schemes to repeat this mammoth task, again, to borrow their language. And I see here as well in the Q&A live, Helen has mentioned, given that it's taking so long for the general code to be published, how much will it be out of date, require updating once it's published?
Okay, so I think the first thing, there's no tracked changes as such between the consultation draft and the final version, but we will, on the same day that it's published, be publishing our final consultation response. And that does go through module by module and deals with the major changes in each module. We've made lots of minor changes to words and commas and stuff that sort of just improves it grammatically. So we haven't tracked every single one of those. Trust me, at one point we actually found out how many colors Word has for track changes and beat it. So yeah, full track changes wouldn't work, or certainly in a couple of modules. But yes, I think broadly speaking, all the expectations are pretty much the same, except in a couple of areas where we're introducing new things. So that would be the own risk assessment, the risk management function, and the remuneration policy, I think, are probably the ones where there's been the most changes in terms of expectation, but they're not especially big. I don't think anyone is going to be particularly upset by them, put it that way. In terms of how out of date it is, this code was always designed to be updated. So it wasn't designed to get to its 18th birthday untouched. So that's a positive. The code as it stands reflects legislation as of about mid-September last year. We have checked in terms of statutory instruments that have come in subsequently. There's nothing, and statutory instruments that we anticipate coming into force in April as well. There's nothing at the moment that we believe seriously affects the contents of the code.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So I think that also answers your question, Michael, who also asked about whether or not that there would be clear track changes made from the previous draft to compare them easily. But there was also a question that the PLSA had as well from our consultation response about going forward. Is there a way to track changes going forward as well, so that sort of people don't have to repeat this exercise sort of every year?
Yes, I mean, certainly the idea is that now we've done the hard work, amendments in the future are much easier. So hopefully, amendments in the future will be localized. We don't expect anything being quite as, root and branch rebuild of our expectations in running a pension scheme again. So it might well be that we open modules up and say, well, actually, as a result of this or of changing expectations, we anticipate changing this. So we can actually kind of focus down on the module, and it will be easier for people to kind of go, oh, well, that's what it says at the moment. That's what they're proposing to do. So it'll be a much more constrained set of changes. That said, at the same time, if anyone does want to comment on any other aspect of the code when we next open it, we will be more than happy to consider that. We do have to kind of allow for consequential or minor amendments as well that people would spot. So yeah, an example might be, I don't know, trustee knowledge and understanding, which has gained more prominence in the code because it's easier to find now because it's in the code. And yeah, that might be an area that we perhaps look at again in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm just going to change approach briefly and shine a spotlight on our LGPS members who have been voting as well for one of the popular questions here. So just the next couple of questions will be on the LGPS and public sector schemes. Aaron is asking, which has gotten quite a lot of votes as well, it would be good to understand how the reader can determine which elements apply to different types of fund, especially coming from an LGPS perspective. Will it be clear which modules and expectations relate to the LGPS and other public sector schemes?
Hopefully, yes. Hopefully we have improved the clarity of who it applies to an awful lot. So we do recognise that was one of the key failings of the original draft. So yes, it is much clearer in that respect. Is there a central log or central index of which modules apply to which schemes? No, there isn't, because we did actually suggest doing that, and we actually fell foul of sort of some legal concerns about, well, there's lots of ifs, buts, and maybes in a lot of these modules, so it's not easy to kind of do a yes, this does apply, and no, this doesn't, or just grey area in the middle. So yeah, I'm afraid, unfortunately, on first reading, it's probably a case of flicking through the 51 modules and just reading the opening paragraphs.
Okay, fantastic. So moving along, again, sticking with the public sector schemes, this is from Mary. I think I know the answer to this, but just to check, because this is a really important question, it would be interesting to understand any TPR expectations relating to ESOG and ORA for public sector pension schemes.
So the ESOG and the ORA do not apply to public sector schemes, or public service schemes, rather. but a lot of the principles that are contained within those modules do. So while there is not the big badge, big banner kind of catch-all thing that is the ESOG, an awful lot of those aspects of the ESOG do still apply to public service schemes. So just because it's within the ESOG banner doesn't mean that it doesn't apply.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And then one from the PLSA actually. So I remember during the consultation phase 2 years ago, some of our members from the LGPS came to us to say the term governing body was too broad, too difficult, applies to too many different segments of the governance structure depending on the circumstance. Do you have a reply to our members in the audience who came to me with that particular question?
Yes, and I actually thank an LGPS fund for suggesting the solution that we have come up with as well. So a lot of the problem with that was we had bundled the scheme manager and the pension board together within the governing body term, which, yes, is possibly a bit too confusing and a little unfair, particularly on LGPS funds. So what we have done instead is pin virtually all of our expectations on the scheme manager, because that is actually where they fall in legislation. There are a few that fall on pension board, knowledge and understanding, for example. Those are specifically called out within the module. So the governing body is in general cases for public service schemes is the scheme manager now. Unfortunately, what we can't do is solve the problem of who the scheme manager is at a local level for LGPS funds, because I know that that's a constant problem, but that unfortunately is a local issue. It's not one that we can resolve.
Okay, I hope those in the audience who were waiting for that answer are happy with that. And if not, put your grievances in the chat box and I'll grill him on it. So, okay, so another question here that's gotten quite a lot of votes is, although the code isn't law and more a template for good behavior, is there a date by which you would expect schemes to be fully compliant with the code? So again, it's about the implementation stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that one. So legislatively, schemes should be compliant with it already, but of course they can't be because they haven't seen it. So that is to say that on a strict legislative basis, technically you should be compliant with it from day one. But please do not think that this means that we as a regulator are going to be knocking your door down on day two saying, why haven't you done this? We appreciate that there's a lot of work involved in this, especially for schemes for governing bodies who haven't necessarily been aware of all the expectations, or are actually, of finding that we've sort of increased the range of expectations. So I think from our point of view, certainly in the early months, years, it's a case of kind of understanding where your gaps are, having that plan to get there. That's part of the governance journey. So, just because you're not doing it yet doesn't mean that that's necessarily a bad thing. If you are prioritizing something else, you only have limited resource, you only have limited time, and you are prioritizing the big risk areas that you have identified, we don't have a problem with that particularly. It's all, it is, as I say, it's a governance journey to make sure the schemes get to the right place.
Okay, as part of that governance journey, someone has asked a question which has gotten quite a lot of votes here as well. Are there any examples or templates for the ORA schemes to use? And also just to flag as well, the PLSA does have an MSG on this, so come to us for the link afterwards if that would be helpful.
Yes, yeah, we got a lot of requests for templates for various bits. Template ORA, I think, was possibly the biggest request we got in the consultation response, and we did consider it, but where we changed the ORA slightly in consultation, and where we realized that we are dealing with schemes from 2 lives up to several million, there isn't a template that actually covers that range. And I mean, obviously, and DB, DC, hybrid, and all points in between as well. So where we ended up with a template was essentially the module, but with some of the text taken out, which we didn't actually think was much use. So as the ORA is very much an internal document, I think it's what works for that governing body is the key point there. So no, there's no particular fixed template.
Okay, so whatever works for the particular situation then. Okay, so another popular question here. This is really more about the kind of pragmatic day-to-day. So Graham is asking, whilst the online navigation of the draft code is very good and easy to access, could we also have a downloadable single PDF with section links of the draft code, final code when it's ready? It'd be really useful as a reference.
Okay. Yes, you can have a downloadable PDF that will be available on publication day and will be available on our website, although because we want people to use the web version, it won't necessarily be easily found once it comes into force. But yes, if you want a big papery thing done up with a bulldog clip, then yes, you are welcome to have one. I don't believe the links in the PDF are live, so it just gives you a hang on, I'll just double check. Oh no, actually, yes, the links in the PDF are actually live. Sorry, I hadn't checked that before now. So yes, you will actually be able to have a PDF version that you can tap on an iPad if you haven't got Wi-Fi in your trustee meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you. So another practical question, Mary is asking, when laid, will the online code facility also go live, or is that when the code comes into force? So again, it's a timeline thing.
Yeah, so the online version, the web version, if you like, will start when the code comes into force. So yes, it will be, yes, end of June, early July that comes in. So in the meantime, it's going to be people playing with the PDF, I'm afraid.
Thanks so much. And just to give you a time check, Nick, we're just over halfway through. We've gotten through quite a lot of questions, a lot more coming through. So we've got about maybe 9 more minutes together on questions. So still a little bit longer. Another popular question that's come through here is, can you share what is in or out based on feedback from the consultation? So specifically, this individual has asked about remuneration policy and DEI, anything like that that you can share.
Okay. What did we get the most? I think probably the things we got the most pushback about were around publication of items. So the question I asked about remuneration policy, there was a couple of other things where schemes are required by law to publish certain items, and we were trying to make more use of the website, and transparency being the best detergent and all that kind of stuff. We accepted there were actually problems with some of that, particularly with the remuneration policy, although some of the challenges we got on the remuneration policy were misunderstanding the purpose of the policy. But generally speaking, yes, we've rode back from having to publish absolutely everything. So it's still optional, or it's moved to being more optional, I think. Since the remuneration policy has come up, that we had a lot of comments, a lot of concerns that we were actually expecting kind of pounds and pence disclosure of what the scheme costs were and things like that, which isn't what was ever intended. It was more about there is a policy for how you determine how much you are paying service providers. And that may have included numbers in certain instances, but it was not that we were expecting you to tell us or tell the world how much you were paying your consultants or your administrators or your professional trustee or anything. So just to kind of relax that one, I suppose. That was never the intention, and that's been made much clearer now in the final version.
Okay, great, thanks. So this one is about the trustee toolkit. Are there any plans, Tina is asking, for updating the trustee toolkit in line with the general code? Will it be updated simultaneously when the general code is published?
Yes, there are plans. Yes, there is work underway. So I actually have stuff in my mailbox at the moment that I've got to go back on. No, it won't. I would almost guarantee that it will not align with the code coming into force. It will come in shortly afterwards. And again, what we're sort of doing with the toolkit is making it more flexible and more up to date initially, and then probably more development after that. At some point down the line, it's not going to happen immediately. But we recognize the toolkit is a very much used and a very much loved, as much as you can love something like that, resource. And yes, so it is getting a refresh.
Fantastic. Okay, sticking with the theme of trustees, there have been a couple of questions related to this, so I'll just scan through as you start to answer this one. So this question is, how do you expect trustees to deal with the requirement for internal audit in practice? And I've seen another question on internal audit, so if you can answer that, and we'll come back to the next one as well.
Yeah, so I think the thing about the internal audit is, again, we haven't been particularly directive about exactly how schemes handle it, because, as I said, the difference between a 2 life scheme and a 2 million life scheme, or even a 2,000 life scheme, is going to be huge in terms of resources and available and access to service providers and things like that. So we left all those kind of audit functions quite open to what works for schemes. And in fact, even schemes that are broadly comparable just will have quirks and things. So it's, again, it's very much trying to make it work for the scheme and understanding principally actually the conflicts of interest that arise potentially from those audit functions, and making sure you've got the competencies in the right places.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And this other question around internal audit is from Paul. So he's talking about, so in 2018, 3 key functions were introduced, including internal evaluation function. The draft code refers the internal audit. So again, will TPR require an audit using qualified auditors?
The internal audit function is separate to the requirement to audit your accounts. So that's always one misunderstanding that we get or have got in the past. So that's separate. No, we don't have a requirement for a qualified auditor to do the internal audit.
Okay, thank you. So there have been a few questions that have come through again about Aura. So just quickly for Mark, he's asked, have there been any further changes to your Aura thinking from the draft code we've seen? I think you've touched on it already, but just in case there's anything else that you could offer.
I can't tell too much at the moment, but yes, the Aura has slimmed down a fair bit. Has the timings changed on it? And hopefully it is a much more useful document than the potential challenge I think that a lot of schemes saw in the original draft.
Okay, this one is about master trusts. I think I know the answer to this, but could you tell us a bit more about, will the code apply, when will it apply, that kind of thing?
So yes, it does apply to master trusts in as far as certain things apply to master trusts, because they apply to all schemes. We haven't as yet unpacked code 15 and started having a look at that again, but it's very much my desire and ambition at some point, not straight now because I've just spent 4 years doing this, but that we actually sort of unpack code 15 and make it into a form that works within this a bit better, so it does it. So does the general code apply to master trust? Yes and no. So they don't have the ESOG requirement, for example, or the Aura requirement, but again, a lot of the elements of the ESOG in particular do still apply to master trusts, and they are probably the standard at which, or the granularity at which we would expect. But I'm sure master trusts are well versed now in what our expectations are anyway.
Okay, we've got probably time for just 2 more quick questions. This one I think you've touched on already, but just if you could add anything more to Simon's question around, in due course, changes, updates to the code, how will they be made? How will they be communicated? I know it's about the kind of, will it be track changes type thing? Anything you could give the audience to reassure them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it will still be exactly the same process. We can't sneak out a change to code, so we still have to consult on it. So I think it will be, it will still be we have opened a consultation on X. It runs for such and such. This is the module that we've looked at. These are the proposed changes that we're making. Please send back your consultation response. Should all be online now as well. We're moving to kind of online consultation submission, and then again it will go through revision. It will get laid in Parliament for 40 days before it comes into force. So nothing changes in terms of the change structure. It's not going to be that you wake up on a Monday morning and find we sneaked something through.
Okay, I'm sure
Unless, of course, you've been
is
living under a
helpful.
brick for 6 months or a year.
No, understandable. Okay, so final question, and then we have to close out. So the most popular question of the ones remaining is from John. Can you tell us more about the factors that have led to the long delay? And because we've been told numerous times over the past months that the code will be out super soon. So I think it's more just about managing the audience's understanding of any further delays that might come and why it has been the case.
I have what I've termed a disaster bingo card, and I have ticked off virtually everything that we could have conceived, barring alien invasion and other global catastrophes. Basically, it has been an awful lot of little things. So various reviews, various builds took time at first. We went into lockdown. We had a global pandemic. And then since then, we've had general elections, we've had Parliament prorogued, we've had, change in monarch. All these things, a big factor, have taken the steam out of the process. At a local level, we've had teen babies, which have taken key members out of the team. We've had work reprioritized for other things at certain times. So, for example, I've been involved in the CDC code as well, which has sort of come into force. So yes, it's time, resource, and then latterly it's just been time again. It's been finding a slot in Parliament. So it's been lots of little things. There's been no one overall cause, but yes, the kind of the after action assessment is interesting in that respect.
No, understandable. So life, unknown external circumstances, and resourcing. Okay, so we're going to have to close out now. But before we say goodbye, Nick, could you, because I know we've covered so much ground today in your presentation, also in the 25 minutes of questions that we've had, if you had to leave our audience with some key messages, what would it be in 15 seconds or less?
First one, don't panic. So, yes, it's new. It will probably appear quite intimidating. Please don't panic. Consider it soberly. Look at it. Do your analysis to what the big issues are. Have a look at your ESOG if that's what applies to you. Think about what the big issues are. Prioritize those according to the available time and resources, and work through it. I think that's probably the thing. Just kind of take it sensibly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick, for your time. Thank you to everyone in the audience. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions, but if there are some big ones, contact us and we'll see if we can get them through to Nick. So thank you again for the audience. To Nick, for those of you who are interested in our next webinar, it's on Dashboard on April 20th. So do join us for that as well. And I hope to see you at one of our events coming up soon. So thank you everyone to the audience, and Nick as well. Thank you for your time.